If you grew up in the 1980s, you probably ate or drank several things on this list without giving them a second thought. But decades later, some were banned, some were forced to change, and a few that people swear were banned actually never were. Here are 20 foods from the 1980s that eventually disappeared from American shelves, and what actually happened to them. 20. Pop Rocks. For a lot of kids, the fun started before the candy even reached your tongue. You tore open that little packet, poured the crystals into your mouth, and waited for the snapping and crackling to begin. By the early 1980s, Pop Rocks had also become attached to one of the most persistent playground rumors of the decade. The story claimed that Mikey, the kid from the Life cereal commercials, had eaten Pop Rocks, washed them down with soda, and died when the combination caused his stomach to explode. None of that happened. The candy worked by trapping carbon dioxide inside sugar crystals. The popping sensation was real. The exploding child story was not. But the rumor became so widespread that General Foods had to reassure nervous parents, and Pop Rocks eventually disappeared from U.S. stores for a period before later returning under different ownership. And this is where precision matters. Pop Rocks were never federally banned. You can still buy them today. What disappeared was a famous candy during a period when one ridiculous rumor became stronger than the facts. For Gen X kids who remember daring each other to combine Pop Rocks with Coke, that rumor may be almost as memorable as the candy itself. 19. Hostess Pudding Pies. If you stopped at a convenience store after school in the 1980s, you probably remember the rack. Twinkies, Ding Dongs, fruit pies, and for a while, Hostess Pudding Pies, chocolate, vanilla, and butterscotch pudding, came sealed inside a sweet glazed crust that could sit in a wrapper until somebody finally pulled it from a lunchbox, vending machine, or gas station snack shelf. Nobody bought these because they looked homemade. That was part of the appeal. They were soft, sweet, cheap, portable, and unmistakably Hostess. The pudding pie itself was never banned by the government. It eventually disappeared as Hostess changed its product lineup, ownership changed, and American packaged foods went through larger reformulations. One of those changes involved partially hydrogenated oils, which were widely used in shelf-stable baked goods during this era, and were later pushed out of the food supply. So the old Hostess pie belongs to two stories at once. One is simply a discontinued snack people still miss. The other is a reminder that the ingredient systems used to make 1980s snack cakes survive for weeks on a shelf did not remain unchanged forever. And judging by how many people still remember the vanilla and chocolate versions, the product lasted much longer in memory than it did in the Hostess catalog. 18. Whip and Chill. This is the kind of product people sometimes remember without remembering its name. They remember their mother making a pink dessert. They remember the bowl in the refrigerator. They remember something lighter than pudding, softer than mousse, and incredibly easy to prepare. That was Whip and Chill. General Foods sold the powdered dessert mix in several flavors. Add cold milk, beat it, let it chill, and dessert was finished. For a generation of families, that convenience was the whole point. Whip and Chill was not banned. It slowly disappeared as General Foods changed ownership, and American shoppers moved toward newer instant and refrigerated desserts. Its ingredient list, however, belonged very much to the packaged food world of its time. Processed fats, stabilizers, flavorings, colors, and milk-derived ingredients designed to turn powder into dessert with almost no work. Some of the broader ingredient practices used across processed foods would later change substantially. But Whip and Chill itself was mainly a commercial casualty. That may explain why people remember it so fondly. There was never a dramatic recall or scandal to close the story. One day, it was simply harder to find, and eventually, the pink pudding your mother used to make became one of those foods people spend years trying to identify from memory. 17. Hydrox. Before Oreo became the sandwich cookie almost everyone recognizes, there was Hydrox. Sunshine Biscuits introduced Hydrox in 1908, several years before Oreo arrived. By the 1980s, Hydrox still had a loyal audience who preferred its darker cocoa flavor, slightly crunchier cookie, and less sweet filling. Then the brand started disappearing. Hydrox changed corporate hands, vanished from shelves, returned, disappeared again, and became one of those products whose commercial history is almost harder to follow than its recipe. But one thing should be clear. Hydrox was not banned. It belongs here because it is exactly the sort of food people remember when they hear the phrase, "foods we lost," and its disappearance generated something stronger than curiosity. People still argue about it. Some insist Hydrox tasted cleaner and less sugary than Oreo. Others remember seeing Sunshine products pushed to the side while Oreo took over supermarket shelves. The brand has been revived in different forms over the years, so even discontinued does not describe its entire history. Still, if your memory is of the Hydrox sold during the 1980s, that specific cookie belongs to a grocery aisle that no longer exists. Sometimes a food disappears because regulators intervene. Sometimes the explanation is business. Hydrox is mostly the second kind of story. 16. Jolt Cola. In 1985, Jolt arrived with a slogan that sounded almost irresponsible even by 1980s standards. All the sugar and twice the caffeine. That was exactly why people bought it. Teenagers drank it before class. College students used it to stay awake. Programmers kept cans nearby during long nights. For some people, Jolt and school vending machines are part of the same memory. A 12-ounce can contained roughly 70 milligrams of caffeine. That was a lot for a mainstream soda at the time. Viewed from the modern energy drink aisle, however, the number looks much less extraordinary. Many current caffeinated beverages equal or exceed it, sometimes by a wide margin depending on serving size. And there is another correction worth making. Jolt was not federally banned, and the dramatic internet stories claiming that ordinary cans of Jolt killed teenagers do not have a solid verified public record behind them. The original brand eventually disappeared after years of changing ownership and business problems, not because the FDA outlawed the drink. Jolt has also returned in different forms at different times. So its real story is more interesting than dangerous soda gets banned. In 1985, 70 milligrams of caffeine helped make a soda notorious. 4 decades later, people can walk into a convenience store and buy energy drinks that make old Jolt look surprisingly restrained. 15. Tab. For some people, Tab tasted terrible. For others, that pink can was untouchable. It belonged to Mom. It sat in the refrigerator beside the regular soda, and children knew better than to take one. Tab became one of the defining diet drinks of the 1970s and 1980s. But by the time millions of Americans were drinking it, the formula had already been shaped by a regulatory fight. The original version used Cyclamate and Saccharin. Cyclamate was prohibited in U.S. food in 1969, forcing Coca-Cola to reformulate Tab around other sweeteners. Then Saccharin became controversial. Beginning in the late 1970s, products containing saccharin carried a warning connected to cancer findings in laboratory rats. That made the 1980s Tab can unusual. You could pull a completely legal soda from the refrigerator and read a cancer warning printed on the package. Later research changed the scientific interpretation of those rat studies, and Congress eventually removed the warning requirement. Tab continued for decades before Coca-Cola discontinued it in 2020. So Tab itself was not banned. Its formula changed because one sweetener was prohibited, another survived a proposed ban, and the drink eventually disappeared because the company stopped making it. That is a much stranger story than simply saying Tab was banned. 14. Cyclamate. To understand why Tab changed, you have to go back to the sweetener that disappeared from American food before the 1980s even began. Cyclamate was cheap, intensely sweet, and widely used in diet foods and beverages. Then federal regulators prohibited its use in U.S. food in 1969. American manufacturers had to reformulate, but other countries made different decisions, and that created an unusual situation during the decades that followed. A diet drink, candy, preserve, or tabletop sweetener could be legal in another country, while the same cyclamate-containing product could not legally be sold as food in the United States. that difference still exists. FDA continues to list cyclamates and their salts among sweeteners that are not allowed in U.S. food. For shoppers in the 1980s, international groceries were becoming easier to find, but ingredient rules did not suddenly become international too. The label might look normal. The product might be sold legally somewhere else. The American rule still applied at the border. Cyclamate is therefore one of the clearest examples on this list of something that really did move from everyday American ingredient to prohibited food additive. And unlike Tab, there is no ambiguity about whether the ingredient itself was banned. 13. Sweet and low. Picture an American diner in the 1980s. Coffee cup, metal spoon, sugar packets, and somewhere in the pile, those little pink sweet and low packets. Saccharin was already almost a century old, but the 1970s turned it into a national controversy after studies linked high doses to bladder tumors in laboratory rats. FDA moved toward a ban. Congress intervened. Instead of removing saccharin from the market, lawmakers required warning labels while additional research continued. So for years, people used sweet and low while staring at a warning that the sweetener had caused cancer in laboratory animals. Then the science changed. Later research found that the mechanism behind the rat findings was not relevant to humans in the same way, and the National Toxicology Program removed saccharin from its list of potential carcinogens in 2000. The warning requirement disappeared. Saccharin remains permitted in the United States. That means sweet and low is another product that is often remembered incorrectly as banned. The real history is better. The government considered a ban, Congress stopped it, consumers used the product under a warning label for more than 2 decades, and the scientific interpretation eventually changed. If you remember that pink packet sitting beside your parents' coffee, you were looking at a live scientific argument every morning without realizing it. 12. Squirt. Long before shelves filled with energy drinks and flavored sparkling water, Squirt had already built a loyal following around its sharp grapefruit flavor. For many years, citrus sodas had a manufacturing problem. The flavor oils did not naturally want to stay evenly mixed with the water. One solution was Brominated Vegetable Oil, better known as BVO. BVO acted as an emulsifier, helping prevent citrus flavor from separating and floating toward the top of the bottle. Consumers usually had no reason to think about it. It was simply part of how certain sodas were made. Over time, major beverage companies began removing BVO from their formulas. Then the federal rule changed too. In 2024, FDA revoked the regulation that had authorized BVO in food, after concluding that its intended use was no longer considered safe. So Squirt did not get banned. The soda cans still exist. What changed was the old ingredient system behind citrus drinks like it. That distinction also explains why someone can remember drinking Squirt in the 1980s, see Squirt in a store today, and reasonably ask how a video can claim the product disappeared. The answer is that the brand survived. The formula did not have to remain frozen in 1985. 11. Brominated Vegetable Oil. Yes, BVO just appeared in the Squirt story, but the ingredient deserves its own place, because it was much bigger than one soda brand. For decades, beverage manufacturers used small amounts of BVO to stabilize citrus flavoring. FDA removed BVO from its list of substances generally recognized as safe in 1970, but a specific food additive regulation continued to permit its use in beverages. That unusual regulatory arrangement lasted for decades. Meanwhile, many manufacturers voluntarily stopped using BVO. By the time FDA issued its final rule in 2024, relatively few American beverages still contained it. The agency revoked the remaining authorization after reviewing newer evidence and concluded that the intended food use could no longer be considered safe. The rule became effective in August 2024, followed by a transition period for manufacturers. This is one case where banned comes much closer to describing what ultimately happened. But even here, the timeline matters. The ingredient was questioned, regulated, gradually abandoned by much of the industry, and only decades later lost its federal authorization. Food regulation usually moves through dates, studies, petitions, reformulations, and transition periods. It rarely happens in the single dramatic moment implied by a thumbnail. 10. Red dye number 3. If you remember impossibly bright red candy, pink icing, cherries, cake decorations, or colorful desserts from the 1980s, red number 3 may have been part of that visual world. Its formal name is FD&C red number 3, or erythrocene. The scientific controversy around it lasted for decades. High-dose studies produced thyroid tumors in male laboratory rats. That point is important. FDA has specifically stated that the hormonal mechanism responsible for those tumors in male rats does not occur in humans, and typical human exposures are much lower than the doses associated with the rat findings. So saying simply, red number 3 was proven to cause cancer in people would be inaccurate. The legal question was different. Under the Delaney Clause, FDA cannot authorize a color additive when it has been shown to induce cancer in humans or animals under the law's standard. Certain cosmetic uses had already been removed decades earlier. Then, in January 2025, FDA revoked the remaining authorizations for red number 3 in food and ingested drugs. Food manufacturers have until January 15, 2027, to reformulate affected products, with a later deadline for ingested drugs. That means red number 3 can still appear in some products during the transition. This story is less dramatic than, the candy dye was poisoning everybody. It is also more accurate. The animal evidence, human relevance, federal law, and final regulatory decision are 4 separate parts of the same story. 9. Old school margarine sticks. Open a refrigerator in the 1980s, and there was a good chance you would find margarine somewhere near the butter. It was cheap, convenient, easy to bake with, and for years was widely presented as a sensible alternative to animal fat. Many margarines and processed foods relied on partially hydrogenated oils, or PHOs. Hydrogenation helped vegetable oils behave more like solid fats, improving texture and shelf stability. It also produced artificial trans fat. As evidence accumulated linking trans fat intake with increased LDL cholesterol and cardiovascular risk, the regulatory environment changed. In 2015, FDA determined that partially hydrogenated oils were no longer generally recognized as safe for use in food. Manufacturers were given time to reformulate, and the agency later completed the remaining administrative steps, removing obsolete PHO authorizations from federal regulations. Margarine did not disappear. Modern spreads use different formulations. That is why this story works best as a formula change rather than a product ban. The yellow stick in a modern refrigerator may look familiar, but the fat system underneath it is often very different from the one found in inexpensive supermarket margarine during the 1980s. 8. Sassafras root beer. For anyone who remembers old-fashioned root beer, sarsaparilla, or bottles with a deeper herbal flavor than modern soda, sassafras carries a lot of nostalgia. Traditional sassafras root and its oil contains saffrole, an aromatic compound that helped create that distinctive flavor. Saffrole eventually became prohibited for use in food under federal regulations. Commercial root beer makers did not abandon the entire flavor. They adapted. Saffrole-free extracts and other flavoring combinations could reproduce much of what drinkers associated with sassafras without using the prohibited compound. That is why the root beer sold today can still taste old-fashioned, even though the regulatory rules underneath the recipe changed long ago. And this is another place where the name of the food can create confusion. Sassafras itself did not vanish from the planet. People still talk about traditional preparations and remember drinking sassafras beverages. The prohibited part is saffrole as a food flavoring under federal rules. The bottles people remember from childhood are therefore connected to a much older flavor tradition whose commercial formula had to adapt to modern food law. For some viewers, the chemistry will be the surprising part. For others, the only important question will be whether the root beer still tastes as good as the bottle they remember. 7. EDB in grain. Nobody walked into a grocery store asking for a box of EDB. That is what made this story unsettling. Ethylene dibromide, or EDB, was a pesticide and fumigant used around stored grain and grain milling equipment to control insects. So the consumer encountered the issue several steps later, in flour, cereal, bread, cake mix, or other grain-based food. By the early 1980s, regulators were increasingly concerned about EDB because of evidence involving cancer, genetic damage, reproductive effects, and contamination of groundwater. EPA suspended major agricultural uses. In February 1984, the agency suspended EDB as a fumigant for stored grain and grain milling machinery. Regulators then had to deal with residues already moving through the food system. That turned an obscure agricultural chemical into a national grocery story. People were not suddenly afraid of grain itself. They were learning that something used far away from the kitchen could still become relevant by the time a loaf of bread or box of cereal reached the table. For an audience that remembers 1980s supermarkets, EDB is a useful reminder that some of the biggest food safety changes happened before the package ever reached the shelf. 6. Alar on apples. This one is impossible to separate from the panic of 1989. Alar was the trade name for damonoside, a plant growth regulator used by apple growers to help manage ripening, firmness, color, and fruit drop. Most shoppers never saw the chemical. They saw apples. Apple juice, applesauce, and food packed into children's lunches. The controversy centered on damonoside and its breakdown product, UAGMH, after animal studies raised cancer concerns. Then, national television coverage pushed the issue far beyond scientific reports and regulatory hearings. Parents became frightened. Schools reacted. Apple growers watched demand collapse. The argument over whether the public response matched the actual level of risk became nearly as famous as the chemical itself. What happened legally is clearer. Uniroyal voluntarily stopped sales of damonoside products registered for food use, and in 1989, EPA approved cancellation of all food use registrations. Sale, distribution, and use on food crops were prohibited. So Alar really was removed from American food production. But remembering the story only as poison apples misses why it became such a defining 1980s event. It was also an early lesson in how television, risk communication, frightened parents, regulators, scientists, and an entire agricultural industry can collide over one piece of fruit. 5. DES-treated beef. In earlier decades, cattle producers used diethylstilbestrol, or DES, as a synthetic hormone to promote growth and improve feed efficiency. By the time the 1980s began, that practice had already collided with a much larger medical controversy. DES had also been prescribed to pregnant women, and later evidence linked prenatal exposure to serious health effects, including a rare form of cancer in some daughters of women who had received the drug. That history increased scrutiny of DES in food-producing animals. Regulators also faced the question of drug residues in edible tissue and whether analytical methods could reliably detect extremely small amounts. FDA ultimately ended the approved food animal uses. Today, DES also appears on FDA's list of drugs prohibited from extra-label use in food-producing animals. The important point for the grocery story is timing. A shopper buying beef in the 1980s was entering a food system that had just moved away from a growth-promoting drug used widely in previous decades. The steak did not suddenly look different. There was no brightly colored package announcing what had changed. The change happened upstream, in livestock production and regulation. That pattern appears again and again on this list. The grocery shelf can look almost identical, even after the rules behind the food have changed. 4. Coumarin in vanilla-flavored imports. This story begins with something that sounds completely harmless. A bottle of vanilla brought home from a trip. Vanilla can be expensive, especially when made from genuine vanilla beans. Coumarin has a sweet aromatic character and historically created an opportunity for cheaper products to imitate part of vanilla's aroma. But U.S. regulations prohibit coumarin from use as a food flavoring. That meant an imported bottle could look like ordinary vanilla while containing an ingredient that was not permitted in American food. There is an important distinction here, because sloppy versions of this story can easily turn into Mexican vanilla is dangerous. That is not accurate. Authentic vanilla produced in Mexico or anywhere else is not the problem. The issue is adulterated products containing prohibited coumarin. FDA still lists coumarin as a prohibited food substance. So if somebody remembers bringing home bargain vanilla during the 1980s, the interesting part is not the country printed on the bottle. It is the gap between products that look similar and formulas that may fall under completely different rules. The bottle in the kitchen cabinet might have looked ordinary. The ingredient list was what mattered. 3. Lead-soldered food cans. This may be the most visually ordinary item on the list. A can of tomatoes in 1982 could look almost exactly like a can of tomatoes today. The important difference could be hidden in the seam. For years, manufacturers used lead-containing solder to join parts of metal food cans. That created the possibility that lead could migrate into food, with acidic foods receiving particular attention. During the 1980s and early 1990s, American manufacturers increasingly moved away from lead-soldered seams as concern over dietary lead exposure grew and production technology changed. FDA ultimately prohibited lead solder in cans used for food sold in the United States. Modern federal guidance still states that lead solder cannot be used in those food cans. This is one of the strongest items on the list because there is no discontinued brand confusion. The government did not ban canned tomatoes. It did not ban canned fruit. It banned a particular food contact material used to construct the container. Consumers kept buying cans, while the cans themselves quietly changed. That makes lead solder a perfect example of how food regulation often works. The familiar product remains on the shelf. The risky part disappears where almost nobody can see it. 2. Potassium bromate in bread. This is one of the easiest items to get wrong. Potassium bromate has been used as a flour treatment and dough strengthening agent. It can help commercial dough develop structure and produce a consistent loaf. Animal studies created concern about carcinogenicity, and many countries eventually prohibited its use in food. That is often where American videos stop the story and say the United States banned it too. As of 2026, that is not correct at the federal level. FDA still lists potassium bromate in its food substance inventory, and federal regulations continue to address authorized uses. California has taken a stricter approach, with its state restriction scheduled to affect foods containing potassium bromate beginning in 2027. So this ingredient belongs near the top precisely because its status is complicated. Many countries rejected it. A major American state moved to prohibit it. Federal rules still have not created a nationwide ban. If you buy bread in the United States, the sensible conclusion is not that every loaf contains potassium bromate. Many manufacturers do not use it. The interesting question is why one ingredient can be prohibited in one jurisdiction, permitted under conditions in another, and avoided voluntarily by individual companies at the same time. Food law is often much messier than a simple banned or not banned list. 1. The watermelon outbreak of 1985. This one earns the final spot because it was not a rumor, a failed brand, or an argument over a warning label. People actually got sick. Around the 4th of July in 1985, health officials in western states began receiving reports of people developing sudden nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, sweating, weakness, and other symptoms after eating watermelon. Investigators connected the illnesses to Aldicarb, a highly toxic carbamate pesticide that was not registered for use on watermelon. Because Aldicarb is systemic, this was not simply a chemical sitting on the outside of the rind waiting to be washed away. The plant could take it up. health officials warned consumers. Watermelons were removed from commerce, and investigators worked through poison control centers, hospitals, laboratories, and state agencies to understand the scale of the outbreak. CDC accounts describe roughly 1,000 reported illnesses across the broader event, while contemporary California investigations recorded more than 1,000 reports in that state alone, depending on the case definition used. That distinction in the numbers matters, but the larger point does not change. This became one of the most significant pesticide-related food poisoning events in American history. And unlike the Pop Rocks rumor, the danger was invisible. The watermelon looked normal. It tasted normal. That may be the most unsettling lesson in this entire countdown. The grocery aisle does not tell you its regulatory history. Looking back, the strangest part may be how ordinary all of this felt at the time. Nobody opened the refrigerator and thought they were living through food history. Tab was mom's soda. Jolt came from the vending machine. Pop Rocks were something you dared your friends to eat with Coke. Sweet and Low sat beside the coffee. Hostess Pies came out of a wrapper after school. And the can in the pantry was simply a can. Years later, the stories split in very different directions. Some ingredients were prohibited. Some products were reformulated. Some warnings disappeared when the science changed. Some brands simply lost the commercial battle. And a few foods people swear were banned never were. That is why the details matter. Now I want to know which one takes you straight back. Was it the taste of Tab? Pop Rocks snapping in your mouth? Whip and Chill in your mother's refrigerator? A Hostess Pudding Pie from the corner store? Or a can of Jolt before school? And if there is one food from the 1980s that you expected to see here but didn't, put it in the comments. There are enough forgotten grocery store stories from that decade to make another entire list.